Hey everybody, welcome back to another reading of the presidents. Let's read about the presidents. We are at William McKinley, who was the 25th president. And he was born on January 29th, 1843. And he died September 14th, 1901, during the first year of the 20th century. 10 months and 2 weeks into the 20th century. He died in Buffalo, New York. But he was born in Niles, Ohio. He was the idol of Ohio. Mr. McKinley was a Methodist. He went to Allegheny College, but did not graduate. He went to Albany Law School. Right now it's about 12. Yeah. About 12:30. Albany Law School, 1866, but did not graduate. He practiced law. His military service was the Civil War. Enlisted as a private in the 23rd Ohio Volunteer Infantry. In June 1861, rose to brevet major. An interesting name there, brevet major, when he was discharged 4 years and a month later. His father was William McKinley Sr., so this is Junior we're reading about. His mother was Nancy Allison McKinley. His wife was Ida Saxton McKinley, and he only had two children. Catherine, who died at 4 years of age, 3 or 4 years of age, and Ida, born in 1873. Doesn't say when she passed away though, or maybe she's stillborn. Political life of Mr. McKinley Jr., Stark County, Ohio prosecutor, U.S. representative, 2 different times, and governor of Ohio for 4 years. He served 2 terms, March 4th, 1897 to September 14th, 1901. He was a Republican, and he was assassinated. He was the 3rd person to be assassinated. First was Lincoln. Then we had another assassination, and then now McKinley. And then later on it would be Kennedy in 1963. His vice presidents were Garrett Augustus Hobart and Teddy Roosevelt. Garrett Augustus Hobart died in office in 1899, and Theodore Roosevelt was vice president from March to September of 1901. The election of 1896, in the electoral vote, McKinley got 271, William Jennings Bryan 176. In the popular vote, McKinley got 7,112,138. Mr. Bryan got 6,508,172 in the popular vote. In the election of 1900, in the electoral vote, Mr. McKinley got 292, and Mr. Bryan got 155. In the popular vote of 1900, McKinley got 7,228,864. Mr. Bryan, William Jennings Bryan, got 6,371,932. The cabinet for Mr. McKinley, The cabinet included Mr. John Sherman as Secretary of State. There you go. John Sherman as Secretary of State. John Hay, H-A-Y, Hay, also Secretary of State, replacing Mr. Sherman. For Secretary of the Treasury, Lyman J. Gage. I think that's correct. Gage. For 4 years. Secretary of War Russell A. Alger. And Elihu Root for 6 months to a year. Attorney General was Joseph McKenna, and then John W. Griggs. And then after Mr. Griggs was Philander C. Knox, 1901. Secretary of the Navy John D. Long for 4 years. Postmaster General was James Gary for 6 months to a year. And then Charles Emery Smith for 2 years. Secretary of the Interior was Cornelius N. Bliss. And then Ethan Hitchcock. And Secretary of Agriculture James Wilson for 4 years. McKinley Tariff of 1890. As an Ohio congressman, William McKinley sponsored the Protectionist Bill, which raised tariffs to 48%, setting a new record. The tariff went into effect 1 month before the midterm congressional elections, and unhappy American consumers voted out the Republicans, including McKinley. The tariff was lowered to 41% 3 years later with the Wilson-Gorman tariff. Mr. McKinley usually wore a red carnation in his buttonhole for good luck of his jacket. Mr. McKinley was the first president to ride in an automobile. Yellow journalism. The sensational journalism practiced by newspapers of the late 19th and early 20th century was nicknamed yellow journalism after a cartoon, The Yellow Kid, that was printed in yellow ink. The leading publishers, John Pulitzer of the New York World and William Randolph Hearst, we know who he is, of the New York Journal, were in a race to sell papers and encouraged their reporters to write stories that were extremely biased rather than objective news. The papers were largely responsible for insisting on the involvement of the United States in the war against Spain. Joseph McKenna was nominated to the Supreme Court in 1898. Mr. McKinley's picture was on the $500 bill from 1928 to 1946. A $500 bill. We don't have those anymore. I think we might still have, I have to look that one up. If we still have a $1,000 bill. I don't think so. We may have had a $1,000 bill. But a $500 bill, that's a lot. For State of the Union, the U.S. population of 1897 was 75,994,575. The national debt in 1901 was 2,143,326,934. There were 45 states in the Union by 1901. We just need 5 more. McKinley's pet parrot was named Washington Post. William Jennings Bryan. You know the debate between William Jennings Bryan and let's see, during the Scopes trial, Clarence Darrow, that's it, that allowed for evolution to be taught in the schools and to take the Bible out of the schools. William Jennings Bryan, born in 1861, died in 1925. One of the most popular speakers in the American history, William Jennings Bryan ran twice against McKinley for the presidency and lost. Teddy Roosevelt remarked, "By George, he will make the greatest Baptist preacher on earth." Instead of becoming a minister, Mr. Bryan became a lawyer. And in 1891, he became Nebraska's first Democratic congressman, picking up the cause of farmers. He championed free silver. His speech proclaiming, "You shall not press down upon the brow of labor this crown of thorns. You shall not crucify them upon a cross of gold," won him the presidential nomination in 1896, making him the youngest candidate ever at the age of 36. And I think now Vivek Ramaswamy is the youngest candidate on the Democratic side, on the Republican side. He ran. This is Mr. Bryan. He ran then and again in 1900 unsuccessfully against McKinley. He tried once more in 1908 against Theodore Roosevelt, and again lost. He later became Secretary of State under President Woodrow Wilson. Bryan, though, is perhaps best known in his last role, assisting the prosecution in the case of John Scopes in 1925. Scopes was on trial for teaching evolution in his classroom. By this time, Bryan was old and ill, and the poor foil to the quick-witted legal mind of Clarence Darrow. The Scopes trial emerged as one of the most famous events of the 1920s. Dingley Tariff of 1897. One of Mr. McKinley's campaign pledges was to raise the tariff. So in July 1897, he called Congress into special session to enact a new legislation. Maine Congressman Nelson Dingley sponsored a bill that raised rates in an average of 46%, but some were over 50%, the highest up to that time. During this high protectionist tariff era, U.S. exports far outspaced imports, and the president began looking to develop reciprocal trade agreements with other nations. So that's William McKinley Jr. I'm going to go to Teddy Roosevelt now. Teddy Roosevelt, number 26. Born October 27, 1858 in New York City. Died January 6, 1919 in Oyster Bay, New York. Teddy, TR, and Trust Buster were his nicknames. He was Dutch Reformed. Went to Harvard College in 1880. He was a lawyer, author, and a public official. Military service included the Spanish-American War. Commanded 1st U.S. Volunteer Cavalry Regiment. He was in the Rough Riders from May to September 1898. Started as a lieutenant colonel and rose to colonel. His father, so Roosevelt is a junior here. His father was Theodore Roosevelt Sr. His mother was Martha Mitty Bullock Roosevelt. His wife was Alice Hathaway Lee Roosevelt, his first wife. A child named Alice who died in 1980. The child Alice died in 1980. His second wife was Edith Carroll Roosevelt. Oh, I'm thinking of the other Roosevelt lady, Eleanor. But that was it was Franklin's wife, Franklin D. Roosevelt. I'm sorry. Second wife Edith Carroll Roosevelt. Wed in 1886. His children was Theodore Roosevelt number 3, Kermit Roosevelt, Ethel Carroll Roosevelt, Archibald Bullock Roosevelt, and Quentin Roosevelt, who died in 1918. And Theodore Roosevelt died a year later. For Theodore Roosevelt Jr., his political life included New York State Assemblyman for 2 years, U.S. Civil Service Commission for 6 years, looks like, and then New York City Police Board Commissioner for 2 years, Assistant Secretary of the Navy for for 6 months to a year, and then governor of New York for 2 years, vice president from March to September of 1901. He served 2 years, September 14th, 1901 to March 4th, 1909. Succeeded to presidency upon McKinley's death and completed that term. He was a Republican. The reason he left office was he declined a third term. Vice President was Charles W. Fairbanks. The election of 1904. The election of 1904 for the electoral vote. Roosevelt got 336. Alton B. Parker got 140. In the popular vote, Roosevelt got 7,630,457. Mr. Parker got 5,083,880. Quite a big gap there. Oh, big cabinet here. Some of these are repeats from McKinley's. Secretary of State John H. Hay died in office in 1905. Elihu Root for 4 years. Secretary of the Treasury Lyman J. Gage for 6 months to a year, and then replaced by Leslie M. Shaw for 5 years. George B. Cortelyou for 2 years as Secretary of the Treasury. Secretary of War Elihu Root for 3 years. William Howard Taft for 4 years as Secretary of War. After Taft was Luke E. Wright, 1909. Attorney General for Lander C. Knox for 3 years. William H. Moody for 2 years. And then Charles J. Bonaparte for 3 years. Secretary of the Navy John D. Long for 6 months to a year. After him was William H. Moody. After Moody was Paul Morton. Charles J. Bonaparte for 6 months to a year. Victor H. McCaff for 2 years. And then Truman Newberry for a year. Continuing, Postmaster General Charles E. Smith for 6 months to a year. Henry C. Payne, Payne, who died in office, 1904. Robert J. Wynne, Wynne, 6 months to a year. And then George B. Cortelyou for 2 years. And finally, last Postmaster General under Roosevelt was George Von L. Meyer for 2 years. Secretary of the Interior Ethan A. Hitchcock, followed by James R. Garfield. I wonder if it's related to the other James Garfield. I believe he is. Secretary of Agriculture James Wilson. First Secretary of Commerce and Labor George B. Cortelyou, and replaced by Victor H. Metcalf and Oscar S. Strauss. So first, we have the new Secretary of Commerce and Labor for the first time in 1903. Interesting. Mr. Roosevelt was the first president to ride in an airplane and a submarine. Supreme Court appointments include Oliver Wendell Holmes, William R. Day, and William H. Moody. State of the Union under Roosevelt. In 1901, 75,994,573 population. National debt in 1909, 2,639,456. No, I'm sorry. 2,639,546,241. A new state added to the Union in 1907, and that was Oklahoma, which makes it 46. Mr. Roosevelt hated the nickname Teddy Roosevelt. Hated that name. That's okay. He's dead, so we can call him Teddy Roosevelt. Prior to Roosevelt's presidency, the presidential home was known as the Executive Mansion. After putting White House on his stationery, others then used it as the official name. Mr. Roosevelt had extremely poor eyesight. When he went to Cuba in the Spanish-American War, he had several pairs of spectacles sewn into his uniform. Interesting. Teddy bears. Let's read about teddy bears. During his first term, Mr. Roosevelt was hunting in Mississippi, but had no luck after 3 days. A guide found an old bear and, after exhausting it, tied it to a tree for Roosevelt to shoot. Roosevelt refused, since it lacked a sporting chance, but ordered its suffering ended. Washington Post cartoonist Clifford Berryman sketched the president's refusal to slay the bear. The cartoon immediately became popular, and in time the bear appeared with a rounder, cuter form, which coincided with the new stuffed animal, the teddy bear. Aww. Books by Theodore Roosevelt. Roosevelt wrote 35 books on various topics ranging from history to outdoor life, including the Naval War of 1812, written 70 years later, Hunting Trip of a Ranchman in 1885, Life of Thomas Hart Benton, 1887, Governor Morris, a book about Governor Morris in 1888, Ranch Life and the Hunting Trail, 1888, The Winning of the West, 1769 through 1807, 4 volumes, which took about 7 years to write, New York, a book about New York in 1891, Hero Tales from American History, 1895, Rough Riders, 1899, American Game Trails, 1910, The New Nationalism, 1910, History's Literature and Other Essays in 1913, Theodore Roosevelt, an Autobiography in 1913, Through the Brazilian Wilderness, 1914, Life Histories of African Game Animals, 1914, America and the World War, in 1915, Fear God and Taking Own Part, 1916, The Foes of Our Own Household, 1917, National Strength and International Duty, 1917. Wow. A lot of books. Roosevelt was the first American and first president to win the Nobel Prize. Nice. Turning the page here. Mr. Roosevelt liked coffee. He drank nearly a gallon of coffee a day and coined the phrase, good to the last drop, when he drained a cup of Maxwell House coffee. Mr. John Hay, born in 1838, died in 1905. Only one man in Washington, D.C. could brag he began his government career serving President Abraham Lincoln and ended it by working for President Teddy Roosevelt. John Hay served as a personal secretary to Lincoln, and after the president's assassination in 1865, Mr. Hay traveled to Europe, where he worked for various American legations. When he returned to the U.S., he briefly worked as a journalist before accepting a post in President Grant's administration as Assistant Secretary of State. Then in the 1880s, he returned to writing and co-authored with fellow Lincoln Secretary John Nicolay a major biography on the former boss called Abraham Lincoln, A History. Hay returned to government service in 1898 and became Secretary of State for friend William McKinley and continued at that post for Roosevelt. In a letter to President Roosevelt, he coined the phrase, that splendid little war. When describing the Spanish-American War, Hay's distinguished career ended with his death in 1905. Crazy. 9, 10, 7, 8, 9, 10, so 70, about 72, 73. And that ends Teddy Roosevelt. Let's see. Okay. I don't have the time right now. William Howard Taft, number 27. Last one for today. Born September 15th, 1857, Cincinnati, Ohio. Excuse me. Died on March 8th, 1930. He was known as Big Bill. He was a Unitarian. Went to Yale, 1878, and University of Cincinnati Law School, 1880. He was a lawyer. No military service. His father's name was Alfonso Taft. His mother's name was Louise Maria Torrey Taft. His wife was Helen Nellie Sharon Taft, married in 1886. Children was Robert Alfonso Taft, Helen Heron Taft, who died in 1987. Robert Alfonso Taft died in 1953. Charles Phelps Taft died in 1983. Assistant Prosecutor of Hamilton County, Ohio, is for William Howard Taft. Assistant Prosecutor of Hamilton County, Internal Revenue Collector of Ohio's 1st District, Assistant Solicitor of Hamilton County, Cincinnati Superior Court Judge, U.S. Solicitor General, 6th U.S. Circuit Court Judge, and ex-officio member of the 6th U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals, Commissioner and then Governor General of the Philippines, Secretary of War, and then Chief Justice of the United States. One term in office, March 4th, 1909 to March 4th, 1913. He was a Republican. He lost the election in 1914 to Woodrow Wilson with the fewest popular votes of any incumbent president seeking re-election. His vice president was James S. Sherman. In the election in 1908, Mr. Taft got 321 electoral votes. William Jennings Bryan got 162. In the popular vote, Taft got 7,676,320. Mr. Bryan got 6,412,294. The cabinet of William Howard Taft included Philander C. Knox as Secretary of State. Secretary of the Treasury was Franklin McVeigh. Secretary of War was Jacob M. Dickinson, followed by Henry M. L. Stimson. Attorney General was George W. Wickersham. Secretary of the Navy was George von Langenmeyer. Postmaster General was Frank H. Hitchcock. Secretary of the Interior was Richard A. Bollinger, followed by Walter L. Fisher. Secretary of Agriculture was James Wilson. Secretary of Commerce and Labor, Charles Nagel, Nagel. The Taft family in politics. The Taft family served in government for generations. President Taft's father, Alfonso Taft, was Grant's Secretary of War. Taft's older son, Robert, represented Ohio for years in the U.S. Senate, while another son, Charles, served as Cincinnati's mayor in the 50s. The president's grandson, Robert Jr., was an Ohio senator in the 70s. A great-grandson served as governor of Ohio 1999 to 2007, and we'll find out who that is. Other relatives have served in diplomatic positions and as advisors to the White House. Mr. Taft was the first president to preside over the 48 contiguous states. there was a court case called Olmstead versus United States. Olmstead versus United States in the Supreme Court decision, in which a majority opinion written by Taft found that the defendant's Fourth and Fifth Amendment rights were not violated by use of wiretaps and telephone conversations conducted by federal agents without a warrant. This decision stood until a later Supreme Court decision reversed it in 1967. Taft was the heaviest president and weighed over 330 pounds. After getting stuck in the White House bathtub, one was custom made for him. Supreme Court appointments. Horace H. Lurton, 1910. Charles Evan Hughes, 1910. Edward D. White, 1910. Willis Van Devanter, 1911. Joseph L. Lamar, 1911. And Mahlon Pitney, 1912. State of the Union. Population of 1909 was 95,972,266. National debt in 1913 was $2,916,204,914. The president's salary was $75,000 a year. 2 states were added to the Union. New Mexico in 1912, followed by Arizona in 1912, which makes it 48. There was the Payne, P-A-Y-N-E, and Aldrich Tariff Act of 1909. The Payne-Aldrich Tariff Act was originally meant to lower tariff rates, but as it passed through both houses of Congress, so many amendments were added that it actually raised duties on 220 imported items and lowered taxes on more than 600 other items. Taft gave a great deal of criticism. Taft received a great deal of criticism from progressives for signing the bill. This became one of the issues for the division in the Republican Party in 1912. Taft kept a cow on the lawn of the White House to provide fresh milk. Robert La Follette, born in 1855, died in 1925. So he was, 69 years, 70 years. Wisconsin governor from 1901 to 1905, Mr. La Follette was instrumental in introducing progressive ideas there, including the Civil Service Commission, regulation of railroads, corporation tax, and primaries for state offices. When he became U.S. Senator in 1906, he pushed progressivism in Washington and unsuccessfully sought the Republican presidential nomination in 1908 and 1912. He opposed American involvement in World War I. Interesting. Taft was the first president to inaugurate a new baseball season by throwing the first pitch. Nice. Taft is the only president to later serve in the U.S. Supreme Court and become Chief Justice. You know that? Judge's Bill, 1925. The Judge's Bill was recommended by Chief Justice Taft to lessen the onerous workload of the Supreme Court by limiting its caseload. After its passage, the court could pick and choose which cases to hear, depending upon the constitutional questions raised or points of law requiring clarification. Taft is one of 2 presidents buried at Arlington National Cemetery. John F. Kennedy is the other. Taft was a cousin to Richard Nixon. What? We will deal with Woodrow Wilson in the next video. Have a great day. Bye-bye.